Hello and welcome to the second of the recorded narrations for PowerPoint presentations for NR 323 for the spring 2020 semester. We've been working on lecture 6, which is a multi-part lecture that has to do with digital image processing. In particular, we are now at the point where we can study classification, okay? And classification is probably the most often application of remote sensing type of application. That is, we're taking the spectral information that's been recorded by a sensor and translating that information into thematic classes. So for instance, this is a very popular classification, the National Land Cover Database, that's created using Landsat data for the United States at about 5-year intervals, and it's based on roughly 16 classes that the U.S. Geological Survey has been focused on for their mapping for decades. So simple, basic land cover designations like open water, ice, 4 levels of developed lands, barren lands, deciduous, evergreen, and mixed forests, dwarf, scrub, which is an Alaska only class, shrub scrub. So, when you're looking at things like sagebrush, that would be a shrub scrub, grassland and herbaceous, sedge and herbaceous, and lichens, also Alaska only, and moss. So those are, typically found in seasonally wet permafrost areas, and then cultivated areas, pasture, crops, and finally woody wetlands. So it was 16, and it looks like they added, for the most recent 4 classes that I never use because I don't work in Alaska. So here's an overview here to give you a sense of what goes on when we're doing a classification. Obviously, at the top, we're starting with imagery. But then a little bit further, I've got knowledge of the scene. And depending on what your knowledge of the scene is, there are 2 types of classification. So if on the right you have formal knowledge of what's going on in the scene, that is, for instance, you've got training sites, which is what we'll call them, areas that either on the ground or through photo interpretation of aerial photography, what is at a particular point. If you have that kind of information, you can do a supervised classification. Supervised classification, we'll see, just means that you're going to take that information and you're going to develop for each class that you've identified a different spectral signature. So average and variability of the spectral reflectance in however many bands you have for each land cover type. Now, if you don't have that kind of formal training data, then you might have some kind of formal or informal knowledge. That is, you might not have a sufficient number of plots to really give you everything that you need in terms of formal data required for a supervised classification, or you might only have informal knowledge. That is, you're familiar with a place, but you don't feel like you could put down a particular point and say with any high degree of certainty, this is what is located in this place. And in those cases, you tend to use something called an unsupervised classification. An unsupervised classification means that the computer is going to look for certain certain patterns of spectral response that lots of pixels have. So basically, to put it simply, you're going to try to find types of pixels that appear throughout an image in a regular fashion. Like, if you have lots of water in a particular image, then your unsupervised classification is going to say, oh, there's an awful lot of stuff that looks dark in all the bands. That must be some sort of unique land cover type, and we're going to label it as such. Now, formally, the unsupervised and supervised classification processes give you a set of spectral signatures. So for instance, for water, you would have a spectral signature showing that, dark pixels are associated. So you might have an average for the 7 Landsat bands, and they would all be dark, low values for each one of the bands in that image. So then once you have spectral signatures, you can then use a classification rule. And we'll discuss 4 classification rules here. The 3 listed and another one that's become very popular in the last, say, 5 years, decision tree classification rule. Basically, once you know what the different kinds of pixels are and what their spectral signatures are, you look at individual pixels and say, which one of the spectral signatures I've identified does each pixel look like? And the rule that you use to determine what something looks like is the classification rule. When you're done with that, you then have a thematic image. So an image where every pixel has had a class assigned to it. And then critically, and we'll talk about this in the next lecture, critically, you have to do an accuracy assessment. The human eye-brain combination is very good at tricking itself into thinking that it's created a map that looks like your idea of what's out there in the real world. But in fact, it's very easy to trick yourself. And so you really need to have a quantitative accuracy assessment where you use a separate data source to check on the accuracy with which you assigned various classes to individual pixels. So, image classification, just using the spectral information represented by digital numbers, or whether those are radiance, or you could be using reflectance information depending on the image source you're using. And of course, you're probably using more than one spectral band to characterize each pixel's and assign a class to each pixel. Okay, so the objective is to assign all the pixels in the image to particular classes or themes. So classes or themes could be water, it could be coniferous forest, deciduous forest. You could be doing an agricultural classification, so the classes might be corn or wheat. And then the resulting classified image is a mosaic of pixels, each of which belongs to a particular theme. And so you then have a thematic map of the original image. So conceptually, here's an image. You're starting with the original, in general, multispectral image data. You're developing a statistical description of what the relationship is between those spectral values and some classes that, in this case, have been assigned using an unsupervised classification. So that space there is just, as usually, I plot brightness values in TM band 3 versus brightness values in TM band 4. Each one of those circles is a class. And so what you're saying essentially is if you have pixels that fall, whose values fall within those circles, then it belongs to a particular class. When we get to classification rules, we'll discuss what we do when pixels don't fall within any particular one of those circles. And then once you've identified the class associated with those brightness values, you assign that and create a thematic map. Now, before we continue, we need to discuss a distinction that underlies the rest of the discussion, and that is spectral or information classes. So when we talk about classes, we have information classes, things like land cover. These are the thematic classes you use, and spectral classes, and those are groups of pixels that are spectrally uniform or almost uniform. So information classes are the categories of interest that the analyst is trying to identify in the imagery. For instance, it could be different kinds of crops, different forest types, tree species. It could be different geologic units or rock types or water or beach, or this is the classes that we are interested in. Spectral classes are just groups of pixels that are uniform or near uniform with respect to their brightness values in the different spectral channels of the data. So if you looked around an image, you might see that all forests on south-facing slopes are very similar in appearance. And therefore, if you plotted out spectral values within, say, that band 3, band 4 graph or space that we were just looking at, all those pixels would fall within a relatively small area. And so that would be a spectral class, okay? And the objective in classification is, in some sense, matching the spectral classes in the data with the information classes of interest, because those spectral classes, they have a sort of mathematical reality in the data. All of the similar pixels you can define using a mathematical rule. You could say plus or minus 5% of a particular reference reflectance value. Those would all be belonging to a spectral class. The information classes, as we'll see, have a more complicated relationship to what's going on in the image. There's rarely a simple one-to-one match between these two types of classes. So you may have unique spectral classes that don't actually correspond to any information class of particular use or interest to the analyst. So for instance, you might have a subset of crops that are on, well, like for instance, I've been working in Puerto Rico a lot. They have karst topography. That is, it's topography that has been formed on limestone beds, okay? And so you get very rolling topography. You get a lot of sinkholes. A sinkhole with a forest in it might be a particular spectral type, but you may have no interest in that particular spectral type. You might want to be classifying forests more generally, okay? Alternatively, you can have a broad information class, so forests, that may contain a number of spectral subclasses with unique spectral variations. Okay, and so part of the analyst's job is to decide on what to do with the different spectral classes and how they correspond to the useful information classes that you're trying to derive. So very often when we're doing land cover mapping, we're going to want to aggregate different spectral classes and assign them to information classes. So this is especially the case in when you're using unsupervised methods, because unsupervised methods are just going to give you uniform or near uniform spectral classes, but you might come up with two spectral classes like north-facing and south-facing forest, or north-facing and south-facing crops for that matter, that need to be aggregated in order to create the information class you're interested in, which would be forest or crop. And then this is a relatively simple procedure. You can just take those individual subclasses that you've come up with, so a north-facing, a south-facing crop situation, and just recode them in a GIS operation to a single crop type. So here's an example where that works. You have a single information class, forest. Then you might have spectral subclasses arising from variation in illumination, so shadowed or directly lit. You might have spectral subclasses that arise from variation in species composition, so one dominated by a broadleaf forest, or one where you have a pretty even mix of needleleaf and broadleaf forests. And then you might have subclasses that arise from variations in density. So you might have some areas that are sparse forest, some areas that are dense forest. That's the simple situation, because we can just take each one of these classes and recode it to a single output information class. So even if you'd wound up with, say, 6 classes or spectral subclasses of information of the single information class forest, you could just go through and use a GIS recode operation to get a single output class forest. The more difficult situation is where you have one spectral class and many information classes. So for instance, over here on the left, this is a little subset of Fort Collins. We've got these two, bright red, you can probably guess this is a color infrared image. This is a bright red area, and in 2 different patches. And then actually looking at a national land cover data set for the same area, we find that they've been classified in 2 different ways. The brown patch there is pasture. The yellow patch is grassland. So what we see here is that we have 2 very similar spectral conditions associated with 2 different information classes. And that's where we get into trouble, because then in our classification, we have to try to find ways to develop rules of one sort of another to separate out the 2 classes.